Hello. Today we're gonna do chapter 20, cardiovascular system, the heart. So your heart is located in the area that is known as the mediastinum. The mediastinum is found in the middle of the chest cavity, kind of behind the sternum. It sits right through here. There's an nice open area that the heart fits right inside of. This again is known as that mediastinum. The heart sits kind of within the lungs in that thoracic cavity, in that mediastinum, with the apex of the heart pointing down to the left. The apex is the bottom point of the heart. Your heart sits within a cavity. This cavity, as this picture kind of shows, it's like a balloon. The heart sits kind of inside of it. There is two layers to it once that heart gets inside. These two layers, they work to protect the heart. This is known as the pericardium. This pericardium has a layer that sits directly on top of the heart. That is known as the visceral layer. This visceral layer, as it sits on top of the heart, it's working to protect the heart, making sure that it has protection from everything around it, while the layer that faces the outside away from the heart is known as the parietal layer. The parietal layer actually faces the lungs almost. This layer on the outside, again, is helping to protect, and within the middle of this pericardium, we get what is known as this pericardial cavity. It is this opening or area between, and this is filled with a serous fluid. Again, it helps protect the heart from any kind of impact. It kind of acts as a shock absorber, a cushion for the heart. This is working to, again, protect your heart, since we need our heart to survive. So as I mentioned, it has an inner and an outer layer, that visceral and that parietal layer. Visceral sits on top of the organ, parietal faces away from that organ, and then there's that fluid-filled space in the middle that is filled with this serous fluid. Our heart technically has 3 layers in the walls of the heart. There's 4 different chambers within the heart. We have arteries that go off the heart that take blood to the lungs. We have a main artery on the heart that's going to take blood to the rest of the body. We also have veins that drain into the heart. So we're going to go through all of those different parts. So as I mentioned, there are 3 layers in the walls. They are the epicardium. That is the outermost layer. That is the layer that comes in contact with that visceral layer of the pericardium, that kind of balloon that the heart sits around. The myocardium is the middle layer. Myo for muscle. So this is our cardiac muscle. The cardiac muscle is the muscle that does the work of the heart. It pumps blood. It's also involuntary because we cannot tell our heart to beat at a specific beat per minute. All we can do is let our heart beat at whatever rate it's predetermined to sit at. The innermost layer of the heart is known as the endocardium. That endocardium lines the inside chambers of the heart. All three of these different layers are going to make up the walls of your heart. So we have that endocardium on the inside, the myocardium in the middle, which is our muscle. And then we have that epicardium on the outside that connects directly with that visceral layer of the pericardium. These three layers are the most important parts of the heart because they do the work. So if you've ever, or if you've seen somebody, or if you've ever done CPR yourself, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, it is a procedure that is used to help establish a normal heartbeat in somebody whose heart is not breathing or pumping. And if they're not breathing, also help to get them oxygen. So as you're administering CPR, the heart is pumping, it's pumping oxygenated blood around the body still. So we do these cardiac compressions and artificial ventilation. It can be done mouth to mouth, or there's lots of other equipment around that will let you do this artificial ventilation or breathing for somebody else nowadays, where you don't have to do that mouth to mouth. It just depends on what you have available. If you've never taken a CPR class, depending on which field you plan to go into, anybody in the medical field is going to need to get and maintain a CPR certification. They follow kind of an ABC protocol. They open the airway, there's breathing, there's chest compressions that are all used. There's lots of different ways to go about this, and it is again used when the heart stops. We're trying to keep blood pumping through the body because we need blood to get to the brain. So if we can resuscitate, get this person's heart repumping, they don't lose that oxygen to their brain in the meantime. You lose oxygen to your brain, those brain cells start to die. So we're trying to prevent that brain damage. There's a lot of different conditions that affect the heart as well. Pericarditis, anything that has that itis at the end, itis, means it is some sort of inflammation. Pericardium is what is affected for pericarditis. A lot of times if you break down the words, you can figure out what the words mean, or where in the body this is talking about as well. So we have acute pericarditis. It happens all of a sudden. There's nothing specific that set it off. Could be related to some sort of infection. We have chronic pericarditis. It builds up over time. Fluid starts to build up around that pericardium. And if fluid builds up, it puts pressure down on the heart so it can't beat as well. It can't pump blood as well. Myocarditis. Well, that's going to affect Myo means muscle, so it's going to affect that muscle. So we get inflammation of the myocardium, that middle layer of the heart. This is usually due to some kind of viral infection. Viral infections, if you don't rest and take care of yourself when you have some sort of viral infection, some of these viral infections can travel to other places in the body, including the heart. So that's why when you're sick, it is important to take care of your health, take care of yourself, because these viruses can do a lot of damage if you don't take care of yourself. Endocarditis. Endo, that inner layer of the heart. So that inner layer gets inflamed. Bacteria can cause endocarditis, and it usually involves heart valves. We'll go through these different heart valves here shortly, but the valves are what separate the different chambers of the heart. These valves are what are important with keeping blood where it's supposed to be. So our different chambers of the heart. We have a right and a left upper chamber and a right and a left lower chamber. The upper chambers are known as the atria. We have a right atria and a left atrium. Atria or atrium for one. Then we have two lower ventricles. We have a right ventricle and a left ventricle. So if we look at this picture here, you can find this right ventricle down here at the bottom. We also have our left ventricle on the other side. We have part of the right atrium there, part of the left atrium. The atrium tend to sit more towards the back just because of all these blood vessels, as you can see coming off of the front. You can see on a real human heart as well, you have that right ventricle, that left ventricle, and then we have part of that left atrium and that right atrium, the auricle. The auricle is an area that expands and completely collapses down when there's no blood in the heart. It expands out as that atria is filling up. It just gives extra space within that atrium. So if we look at the back, here you can see that whole left atrium, that entire right atrium. You can see all the blood vessels coming off the back even. We're going to go through a lot of these, and we'll go through them in lab as well, and work on being able to identify this stuff. Of course, you can still see that left ventricle and that right ventricle. So if we slice the heart down the middle and along that coronal plane, the right atrium, the one that's in this drawing anyways, it's in blue. It's in blue. Blue technically designates deoxygenated blood. So it's blood that is low in oxygen. And any of the drawings, anything in red is noted in as oxygenated blood. So it is rich in oxygen, has lots of oxygen to it. They draw them out that way to kind of help distinguish which is which, especially when you're learning. It does make things a lot easier when you see blue. Oh, that must have low oxygen. When you see stuff that's in red, that must have high oxygen. So they drew the heart this way just so we could see this right atrium is going to receive blood from the body and the heart, because the heart has its own blood vessels. If we look up here, you can see all those red and blue blood vessels on both the front and the back. We're going to go through what those are shortly. But the right atrium is going to receive blood. So this large blue blood vessel here, this large blue blood vessel is the superior vena cava. It's superior because it's above that right atrium. We also have below that atrium down here, we have the inferior vena cava. Both of those are going to drain blood into that right atrium. We also have one other blood vessel that's going to drain into that right atrium. It is known as the coronary sinus. This shows the opening of the coronary sinus. Coronary means heart. So these are blood vessels from the heart. If I come back up here, this in the back of the heart, this is that coronary sinus. This is where blood drains into from all the blood vessels of the heart before that coronary sinus drains into this right atrium. So this right atrium is receiving blood from the body as well as from this coronary sinus, and it is all blood that is low on oxygen, so deoxygenated blood. Between the right atrium, we have a valve. It separates the blood from that right atrium and that right ventricle. This valve, there's a couple names for it. One of the names is the right atrioventricular valve. The other name for it, which is listed on the human heart, is known as the tricuspid valve. Tricuspid because it has three pieces that come together to close. So the tricuspid valve is going, or the right atrioventricular valve, are going to separate that right atrium from that right ventricle. This right ventricle down here at the bottom, again, it's still kind of drawn in blue. So we know that that blood that is going into that right ventricle is low on oxygen. That right atrium is going to drain blood down from that right atrium into that right ventricle. And it is going to go through that right atrioventricular valve or that that tricuspid valve. Tricuspid for three cusps that come together to close that valve. From here, once the blood drains into the ventricles, do you notice, do you see here, there's a lot of muscle in the ventricles versus the atria. There's really not a lot of muscle there. It's not as thick. We look at the human heart here, you can even see there's not as much muscle as there is in the ventricles here. So what these ventricles are doing, this right ventricle is going to pump blood this way. This is known, we have another valve. This is our pulmonary valve. Pulmonary for lungs. So we are taking the blood from the right ventricle, we are pumping it through this pulmonary valve into the pulmonary arteries. This is where the one place where people get confused. It's the pulmonary artery, it's in blue. It's blue because it is deoxygenated blood or low blood with low oxygen in it. This deoxygenated blood is going to the lungs to pick up oxygen, but it's leaving the heart, so it is still considered an artery. Anything that leaves the heart is an artery. Anything that comes back to the heart is a vein. So we just pump blood out through this pulmonary artery. It goes to the lungs. It's going to come back. Once the lungs are done with the blood, they added oxygen. The blood is going to come back through the pulmonary veins. We have a left, whoops, wrong one. We have a left and a right pulmonary veins coming from the left lung and the right lung. These are going to drain into the left atrium. This time, the atrium is red. That tells us that the blood in there is rich in oxygen. So it is oxygenated blood. You notice the pulmonary veins are also red. They are veins. That just means they're coming back to the heart. But they are high in oxygen, so they are drawn in red. Between the left atrium and this left ventricle, we have the left atrioventricular valve. Atrium, ventricular, ventricle. So it's between the atrium and the ventricle. That's that left atrioventricular valve. It is also known as the bicuspid valve. Bicuspid because it has two cusps that come together. The right side is the tricuspid. The left side is the bicuspid valve. So once that blood comes into the left atrium, it'll pass through the left atrioventricular valve. It'll go to that left ventricle. That left ventricle is then going to take that blood. It came from up here, go down here. It is now going to pump blood out this way. It goes underneath that pulmonary artery. It goes into the aorta, the largest artery in the body. If we look at this human heart, look at how large this left ventricle is, how thick the wall is on that left ventricle versus the right. This right ventricle over here is very narrow. The walls are very thin compared to that left. Let's think about why. Well, when blood gets pumped out of the the left ventricle, it's going through the aorta and then it's going to the rest of the body. It's getting pumped out to your arms, your legs, all the organs in your abdomen, your neck, your head, your brain. It's pumping blood everywhere. So it needs to pump with a great amount of force. So this great amount of force that is this left ventricle is generating to pump blood out, they need larger muscle to make it happen. This right ventricle over here, the walls aren't as thick. They're only pumping blood to the lungs. The lungs sit right next to the heart. So it doesn't need to pump blood as far as the left ventricle, because the left ventricle is pumping that blood that's going to go down to your left foot. That's a long distance. So The left ventricle walls have to be thicker to get that blood all over the body. So our heart is made of a fibrous skeleton. This kind of fibrous skeleton gives a place for these heart valves to attach, allows for the cardiac muscle bundles to insert. We'll go through what those are, but it also prevents overstretching of all of these valves. We've got 4 different valves in our heart. It serves as an electrical insulator. We'll go through how your heart actually has its own electrical system. So these different valves, I'm going to kind of leave this here. We can see all of these different valves. You see this right atrioventricular valve that's known as that tricuspid valve here. Because if you notice, there's 1, 2, 3 parts that come together. That's why it's tricuspid, 3 cusps. We also have this left atrioventricular valve. Because here we have 1, 2 cusps that come together to close. This is why it is known as the bicuspid valve. We also have semilunar valves. These semilunar valves are the aortic valve and this pulmonary valve. They're preventing blood from backflowing and from the arteries into the ventricles. When those valves close, blood is being pumped out through that pulmonary artery or that aorta. We don't want that blood to come back into that ventricle. We want blood to keep going forward. These atrioventricular does the same thing. The blood goes from those atria, it gets pumped through those atrioventricular valves. Those valves shut. We don't want blood to go pushing back up into the atria when we're trying to push blood from the ventricles out of the heart. We want to make sure we're getting enough blood pumped out wherever it needs to go. These valves, they have what are known as chordae tendineae. Chordae tendineae are all of these little strings, kind of looks like, that are holding these valves in place, per se. These chordae tendineae are just those little string things that are holding the valve. And then this chordae tendineae are attached to what are known as papillary muscles. Each of these little finger-like projections coming up are known as papillary muscles. Again, the papillary muscles are going to contract and relax to help these valves open and close. That is their main job. When the valve is closed, we don't want blood going from the atria back up to the ventricles. We want to be able to pump that blood that goes into the ventricles out of the body, or out of the heart, sorry, out into the body or to the lungs. So here we can kind of see on a human heart. We have the left atrioventricular valve over here, or that bicuspid valve. Then we have the right atrioventricular valve, or that tricuspid valve. We can also see that aortic valve. It's pretty large. The pulmonary valve is not as large, but it's still pumping blood out to the rest of the body. When one set of valves is open, the other set is closed. So when blood is draining from the atrium down to the ventricles, those semilunar valves are closed. We need enough blood to back up into those ventricles, so when those ventricles contract, that blood goes pushing out. Just like when these pulmonary valve, that aortic valve, or those semilunar valves are open, those right and left atrioventricular valves are closed because we want that blood that's in those ventricles to go out to the body or to the lungs, not back up into the atria. So we need to keep valves open or closed depending on, one's always open, one is always closed. They go back and forth, switching between. So I've mentioned it slightly when I've talked about the different parts of the heart. We have a systemic circulation. That's where that left side of the heart is pumping that oxygenated blood out to the rest of the body. And then we have that pulmonary circulation. That is that right side of the heart pumping blood to the lungs. So we're getting all the blood from the body into that right atrium, goes to that right ventricle, goes through that pulmonary valve, out through that pulmonary vein or artery. And that goes to the lungs. So here's a nice step-by-step drawing of all of this. That superior and inferior vena cava, along with that coronary sinus, are draining into this atrium. The right atrium will contract and push blood into that right ventricle. Once blood is in that right ventricle, that atrioventricular valve is going to close. That blood will then head up through that pulmonary valve into that pulmonary arteries, and they go to the lungs. The lungs are going to take that blood and add oxygen to it, and it's going to get rid of carbon dioxide. When we get to the respiratory unit, we will learn exactly how that happens. But for now, we're pumping blood to the lungs through the pulmonary arteries. Blood comes back through those pulmonary veins. So it's going to come in one of these two sides, and it's going to drain into this left atrium. When blood is draining into this left atrium, this left atrioventricular valve is currently closed. But when the atrium contracts and pushes blood into this left ventricle, that valve opens as that blood drains into the ventricle, and then that valve is going to close. Once that valve closes, the ventricles are going to contract. They're going to push blood out through the aorta. That aorta is going to pump blood to the rest of the body. It could go up through here to the head and the neck. It can go down to the arms and the legs. As blood goes through that whole systemic circulation, it's going to come back through veins to that inferior or superior vena cava, or the blood that goes to the heart through that coronary sinus. All of this is taking place all day long, every single second of your life until your heart stops beating. So this video here kind of goes through all of the different parts of the anatomy. You can click through that if you would like. So our heart muscle needs oxygen and nutrients to be able to maintain the heart's function, to be able to keep pumping blood. This is known as the coronary circulation. That coronary, again, means heart. So it is pumping blood out to the heart. We are getting blood going to all the different chambers and areas of the heart so that heart muscle can get the oxygen and nutrients that it needs. So those coronary arteries are going to deliver that oxygenated blood to the heart. Coronary veins are going to remove or bring that blood back to the heart so we can get more oxygen again. As I mentioned in the pictures above, it all drains into the coronary sinus, which drains into that right atrium. These arteries and veins, some of them have names, most of them have names. Sometimes there's few here and there that don't, but they usually connect through an anastomosis, where arteries kind of merge or connect from one to another. Veins do the same thing. They connect from one to another as everything comes together as it's going to the heart. So here's a nice pictures because it shows arteries on one, veins on the other. So we have that right coronary artery. As you can see, it's coming right off that aorta. Blood comes right off that aorta. We have the right coronary artery and we have the left coronary artery. Same thing. Comes right off the aorta. That blood is can go follow that right coronary artery. It can follow along that left coronary artery. That left coronary artery turns into a circumflex artery. When it branches, it's going to branch into a circumflex or an anterior interventricular artery, one or the other. So once the branching happens, it changes its name to that anterior interventricular artery or that circumflex artery. This right coronary artery is going to give off different branches. Most of the technically unnamed branch arteries that come off are known as the marginal branches. So they technically have some sort of name, but they're not given a specific name. We can see the arteries that look deeper are technically on the back of the heart, because we also have a inferior interventricular artery that's on the back of the heart. That says between the ventricles, interventricular between the ventricles. Our veins, I showed that coronary sinus, that's on the back of the heart. That drains into that right ventricle, or right atrium. Sorry, I keep messing that up. We have a great cardiac vein that goes down the middle and the front. In the back, we have a middle cardiac vein. We have an anterior cardiac vein, and we have a small cardiac vein. It's a lot easier to see on a model of a heart where you can maneuver it and turn it around instead of trying to envision, okay, this is the front, this is the back, these are the sides. We'll go through those with the models in lab. So with our coronary circulation, if one of these coronary arteries, these arteries that feed the heart, gets blocked, what it's going to do is it's going to cause a reperfusion. So it's going to establish blood flow to that area as fast as it can to prevent damage. So it could start to build new arteries. Arteries get built into different tissues all the time. You gain weight, new arteries get built into that new tissue. So we get reperfusion to that area through arteries that a new artery may branch off to help give that heart the nutrients that it needs. Free radicals. We have a lot of free radicals in our system that we create different enzymes, we create different ways to break stuff down really quickly. But if there's too many free radicals in the body, they can actually cause further tissue damage. Even after we've built new arteries, we've caused reperfusion, we've gotten blood supply back to that area to get nutrients to that area of the heart. But then we've got these free radicals that are still in our blood and in places, and that's causing damage to tissues. It can lead to damage and death of those cardiac tissues. But we try to prevent this through through enzymes. Enzymes break down these free radicals almost as fast as we make them. If we're producing too many free radicals, they can get loose in the blood and they start to cause damage in the body. So our body tries to prevent it. It's not always successful, but our body tries to do anything it can to fix stuff. So stenosis. Stenosis has to do with heart valves. Our heart valves, they kind of stiffen up, causing how far that valve opens to decrease. That is known as stenosis. Those valves may not close completely. That's known as insufficiency. When those valves fail to close completely, that means blood is flowing from those ventricles back into that atrium, or blood is flowing out of those semilunar valves, but those valves fail to close completely, so blood flows back in. So we're not getting enough blood out to the body. A valve prolapse, so that valve goes up the wrong direction. It protrudes into the atrium. So instead of saying secured and closed the way it's supposed to, when that ventricle goes to contract, that valve starts to go up the opposite direction. Rheumatic fever. Anybody who's ever had strep throat before? This is why you need to get strep throat taken care of as fast as possible. Get on some kind of antibiotics as quickly as possible. Don't just wait it out. If you just wait out strep throat, that bacteria can travel to other places in the body, including the heart. And it can cause an inflammatory disease of the heart. It'll attack that connective tissue that makes up the epicardium, the endocardium. It can go to the joints. It can go to the heart valves because those are made up of connective tissue. And it can cause a lot of damage. It can cause stenosis. It can cause insufficiency. It can cause valve prolapsing. Streptococcal infections, that strep throat, that virus can be very dangerous if it's not taken care of. This is why it's so important to, when you have a bacterial infection, get on something. Get it out of your system as fast as you can, because they can cause a lot more damage if it's not taken care of. Ischemia, myocardial ischemia. We're not getting enough blood flow to the heart. The blood vessels that feed the heart, there's not enough blood going to those tissues. It can cause hypoxia, not getting enough oxygen to that heart. And angina, pain in the chest. You can get pain in the neck, the chin, the left arm, the elbow. This is usually a precursor. Sometimes, it's not always, sometimes they may experience these symptoms that may eventually lead up to a myocardial infarction or a heart attack. That is where blood supply is completely cut off to an area of the heart, those tissues die. Those tissues die, they're no longer able to get enough oxygen, or those tissues. Cardiac muscle is really bad at repairing itself. We don't keep stem cells for cardiac tissue at the heart. The satellite cells are stem cells for muscle tissue. They can leave wherever they're at, they travel in the bloodstream to the heart, and they can try to repair that area that was that died. The problem is scar tissue tends to grow faster than these satellite cells can come in and repair. So that area of the heart doesn't function as well anymore. There's different injections that can be given. They can do angioplasty or coronary artery bypass grafting. They can take arteries from somewhere else in the body. They can reroute that coronary artery around, so we can try to get oxygen to the areas around it still. There's also what's known as a silent myocardial ischemia. They go through these ischemic issues, this myocardial ischemia, but there's no pain to it. This is where I was mentioning that it can be a precursor to a heart attack. People who have the silent myocardial ischemia have no warning signs of an impending heart attack. It's out of nowhere. It feels like to them, this heart attack came out of nowhere. There was nothing that no forewarning that something could happen. They have a heart attack. These are the people that tend to have a harder time accepting, because there was nothing that led up to it. They didn't have any kinds of pain in their chest, nothing, before they ended up having a heart attack. So it is possible. It does happen. Happens a lot more than people think too. So our cardiac muscle. Our cardiac muscle, if you remember anything from Anatomy 1 in the tissues chapter, cardiac muscle tends to branch. Cardiac muscle has the striations, just like skeletal muscle does. The big difference between cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle, they have these intercalated discs. This is what holds one cell to the next cell. And part of these intercalated discs, they have gap junctions. Gap junctions help them to send information from one cell to the next cell to allow these cells to contract at the same time, or pretty synchronously. So gap junctions are these little tunnels that allow information to go from one cell to the next cell. So within these intercalated discs, we're going to find gap junctions. Cardiac muscle is still set up the exact same way as skeletal muscle. They have that M line in the middle with that H band of just thick filaments, A band that has thick and thin, the I band that has just thin filaments, and the Z disc in the middle. From Z disc to Z disc is that sarcomere, and that is that contractile unit. That's that area that contracts and relaxes. It's the same thing as skeletal muscle. And I'm not going to go into as much. We don't need, everything works the same. Hopefully you remember it. But we're going to talk more about how cardiac cells are self-excitable, aka autoarrhythmic. They can contract on their own. They do not need the brain or hormones or any other kind of chemical signals in the body to tell them to contract. They can generate those action potentials on their own. So they generate those spontaneous action potentials. So how these work. There's different areas around the heart that trigger different contractions. So we have the sinoatrial node, the SA node. This is where everything starts, is at this sinoatrial node, which usually sits somewhere towards the top of that right atrium. These are the cells that generate these action potentials. They're those autorhythmic cells. They are going to send the signal from that sinoatrial node. It's going to travel down to the atrioventricular node. Atrioventricular, it sits between the atrium and the ventricle. That atrioventricular node is then going to send information down this atrioventricular bundle. It's a bundle of fibers. They are going to branch. So we have a right and a left bundle branch. So they do exactly what it says. The left bundle branch goes to that left ventricle. The right bundle branch goes to the right ventricle. These are all working together so the heart can generate its own heartbeat. This is what I was talking about before, where it was originally thought that cardiac cells couldn't replace themselves, where we have those satellite cells, those stem cells that'll travel around the body, travel to different areas in the body to repair any kind of muscle tissue. But there's a really cool research study that was done where they took a man or a male and they were given a heart from a female. Male has those XY chromosomes. Female has those XX chromosomes. So they put that female heart into that male, and several years later, here's the cool thing. 7 to 16% of those heart cells that were originally transplanted from that female heart were replaced with this recipient cells. They ended up having a Y chromosome in them now that was originally not there. So this is where those stem cells, satellite cells for muscle tissue, can migrate through the blood. They can travel different places and they go through and replace tissues. So this was a really cool study. I thought this was a cool study that was in your textbook, so I had to share that your body will go through and replace tissues, even the heart, over time. So like 16% of this person's heart that was XX chromosome is now XY. That's pretty cool that your body can do that. So this goes through this conduction system. So as I mentioned, everything starts at that sinoatrial node. That sinoatrial node is that pacemaker. They are what sets the actual heart rate. Information goes from that sinoatrial node to that atrioventricular node. That atrioventricular node is going to send everything to the atrioventricular bundle. This is also known as the bundle of His. That's how I learned it. I learned it as the bundle of His, and that was probably 6 or 7 years ago. The atrioventricular bundle is what they call it now. So they like to change names of things over time. So it's good to at least know of the other names because you may still hear it. That bundle of his is going to, or atrioventricular node or bundle is going to branch right and left, one for each ventricle. Those branches, or those bundle branches, they're also known as Purkinje fibers or subendocardial conducting network. When they contract, the ventricles contract. So here's the sinoatrial node is what sets your heart rate. That sinoatrial node causes that atrium to contract. It sends that signal down to that atrioventricular node. It helps to finish that atrial contraction. It then sends that information down that atrioventricular bundle. As the atrium contracts, it is pumping, the contracting of the atrium pumps blood into the ventricles. Both sides work at the same time, right and left. That information that's going down the AV bundle, as that information is traveling down, it is causing the ventricle to start to contract. As it goes down, these right and left bundle branches, or these bundles of Purkinje fibers, sorry. Those Purkinje fibers are causing those ventricles to contract, which is pushing blood out the pulmonary artery or the aorta. So they allow the atrium to contract. When the atrium contracts, it pushes blood into the ventricles. There's a slight delay time, because that delayed time is allowing that blood to finish draining from the atrium to the ventricles. And then when the ventricles go to contract, the atrium are filling up with blood again. So they go back and forth. Pacemakers. People whose heart does not beat in a consistent, normal pattern may be given a pacemaker. Pacemaker is an artificial device it's usually implanted under the skin in the chest, put into the heart, and it works to help the heart maintain a normal heartbeat. Usually has a battery, has some sort of pulse generator in there, and it's maintaining this person's normal heartbeat at a normal rate. I've seen one of these, pretty cool. I saw it in a cadaver, an artificial pacemaker. It was kind of fun to dig out and discover. This video goes through and animates the conduction system on how all of this works. It'll be a good video to click on and kind of check out. This also goes through the conduction system and kind of goes through how everything works. So what influences our heart rate? Well, that SA node that sets everything, that's that natural pacemaker. But there's other things. As I mentioned, that SA node of that heart can act on its own. It doesn't need the brain to tell it anything. But here's the thing. That brain can alter that heart rate. So can hormones. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, those fight or flight hormones, those can change that heart rate. It can change the force of the contraction. So it's our body has ways to react, because think if you're running, that same heart rate as when you're sitting, relaxing, that's not going to get enough oxygen and blood to your muscles and tissues if you take off running after something. Your heart needs to speed up to get more oxygen to your tissues faster. Your brain can set that. Your body tends to go into that fight or flight mode anytime you run, whether it's for fun, running away from something, they still go into that fight or flight mode. So it releases some of that epinephrine and norepinephrine every time you run, because we need to speed up the heart rate to get oxygen to different places in the area. It also slows it down after. So your body is constantly working to maintain, adjust, change your heart rate depending on what you're physically doing or the lack thereof. So if we look at an action potential in the ventricle specifically, that action potential, those muscles tend to contract pretty quickly, but we reach a plateau where that muscle stays contracted before it relaxes. Unlike with or if you remember with skeletal muscle, we tend to get more of a nice round chart. Cardiac muscle contracts and holds that contraction longer. That refractory period, it lasts longer because we need to let those ventricles or those atria fill with that blood. So between the two, they hold contractions longer to make sure all that blood gets out, or all that blood gets out of the heart or from the atrium into the ventricle. Back in the muscle tissue chapter of Anatomy 1, we talked about all the different ways that skeletal muscle generates ATP. Your heart uses anaerobic cellular respiration and creatine phosphate. So that is that glycolysis pathway that provides 2 ATP per glucose molecule. Creatine phosphate is where we take that one of those phosphates. We have ATP. ATP means it's adenosine triphosphate, so we have 3 phosphates. We take off one of those phosphates, so we have adenosine diphosphate plus a phosphate. That phosphate that we took off, we attach to creatine. So we have a creatine plus a phosphate. So that goes over here. We attach those together. And when we want that, when we need energy for something, we take that phosphate off of creatine, put it back onto ADP to give us ATP. We can make ATP from fatty acids in our heart. So those triglycerides. We use more triglycerides because we actually get more ATP from breaking down a fat molecule than we do from glucose. And your heart is pumping all day long, every day of your life, all day, all night, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year till you die. So we burn fats in our heart just because we generate more ATP that way. Lactic acid. Your skeletal muscles make lactic acid as a byproduct in anaerobic exercise. So the going through glycolysis, putting a glucose molecule through that glycolysis pathway generates 2 ATP. It also generates 2 pyruvate molecules. If there is no oxygen available, that pyruvate gets converted to lactic acid. That lactic acid is going to diffuse into the bloodstream. It'll go to the heart. The heart muscle can take that lactic acid and make ATP out of it. It's a cool process. Your heart can start breaking down amino acids. This is when things start to get desperate. We start breaking down amino acids, we're breaking down proteins. You're starting to break down proteins, you are breaking down muscles, you're breaking down organs to start to get energy for your heart to continue to pump. It can also break down ketone bodies. We'll go through those when I think that's either that might be in the metabolism chapter after the digestive system. So I don't know if you may have had your heart recorded on how it pumps, what parts of the heart are working where. You may know somebody who has. This is known as an electrocardiogram. This is reading those action potentials that are happening in different areas of the heart. The parts in blue at the top is where the atrium or the atrial contractions happen. Yellow is the ventricular contractions. So everything starts, I just want to see if it was spelled out here, with this small, P wave. There we go. This small P wave is where everything starts. Atrium are depolarizing during this P wave. So that SA node is spreading those action potentials through the atrium. That's where we get that little tiny deflection upward. Then, so our atrium are contracting here. The next part is the QRS complex, as it's known as. That QRX complex has that large deflection up, goes down below, and then back up to where it was originally. This QRX complex, if we notice the yellow here, our ventricles are contracting at this point. During that QRS, and even into that T interval. We have a PQ interval, a QT interval, and then an ST segment. The QRX complex, it said those ventricles are contracting, so they are depolarizing. When cells depolarize, remember in skeletal muscle and with nervous tissue we looked at as well, but with skeletal muscle, when that cell is depolarizing, it's causing that muscle to contract. When it goes back down to that resting potential is when that muscle will relax. That T wave at the end, that little deflection upward here at the T, that is when the ventricles are repolarizing. So they are going from that positive down to that negative, back to their resting potential. So those ventricles start to relax. And this happens over and over and over again, all day long. So if we start at 1, we start with that P wave. So that action potential is starting at that SA node. So that action potential is starting and it is spreading through the entire atrium. That is what's causing those atrium to contract. It is also known as atrial systole. Systole is when contractions are happening. The next part is that QRS complex. During that QRS complex, those ventricles are depolarizing. Those ventricles are contracting. That is ventricle systole. Systole is a contraction again. So when those ventricles contract, it's ventricle systole. When those atriums contract, it's atrial systole. It all just their name for what is contracting and when. That T wave is when those ventricles are relaxing, so they are repolarizing. Diastole is when something is in full relaxation state. So ventricular diastole is when those ventricles are in that full resting state. or atrial diastole, or when those atrium are in those full resting state. So we use these electrocardiograms to measure what is happening with the heart. There's even those, as I mentioned, those intervals and those segments. We have that PQ interval. So from the beginning of the P wave to the beginning of the QRX or QRS complex is the PQ interval. This is when information, those atrium are excited to the beginning of ventricular excitation. That's the time for that action potential to travel through the atrium the atrioventricular node and those Purkinje fibers that wrap around. We also have that ST segment. That's from the end of the S wave to the end, or to the beginning of that T wave. The ventricular contraction fibers are depolarizing, so they are contracting. The QT interval is from that start of the QRS complex to the end of that T wave. So it's from ventricular depolarization to ventricular repolarization. So somebody who's had myocardial damage, that can be longer. Ischemia in the heart, or any kind of abnormalities in that conduction system, these can be lengthened. This is where sometimes people will be given a stress test because they want to see how somebody's heart reacts under physical activity. I've seen people do a stress test where they're running on a treadmill to see how their heart responds. It all just kind of depends on what's happening in these people's lives, what's causing this heart problems. They will go through and try to figure out, and they try to recreate sometimes some of these issues to try to figure out what is happening. So, cardiac cycle. So contraction, which is at systole, and relaxation. It is one cycle where the atrium contract, relax, the ventricles contract, relax. So it's all the electrical events, the pressure changes, the sounds of the heart, volume changes, everything that is happening is this cardiac cycle. So atrial systole, systole is contracting. Those atria contract, those ventricles are relaxing or relaxed because when the atria contract, it is pumping blood from those atria into those ventricles. Ventricle systole, those ventricles are contracting and they're pumping blood out of the heart. Diastole, again, atrial diastole, those atria are relaxed. Ventricular diastole, those ventricles are relaxed. There's also slight relaxation period where both ventricles and atria are contracted before the next cardiac cycle starts. It's pretty quick, but there is a period where both are technically in that relaxed state. So this goes through that cardiac cycle. This goes through more of that cardiac cycle. This video here goes through an ECG. So it would be worth going through and clicking on each of these videos and watching these Wiley videos on how all of these work. So pressure changes. Pressures are monitored or measured in millimeters of mercury. So we can see atrial systole, those atrium are contracting. Ventricle systole is a lot larger. where those ventricles are contracting. We can see where the valves are open, where valves are closed, how high pressures get, especially as blood is being pumped out of the atrium or out into the aorta versus this green line down at the bottom down here that is going through what is happening in the atria, what is happening at the, I mentioned the aorta here. There's a lot of different pressure changes happening. So these heart sounds, what are these actual heart sounds that we hear? These heart sounds are known as lub dub. Lub dub, lub dub. So what is happening whenever we hear this lub dub sound? Well, we're hearing valves close. Every time you hear a valve close, it's lub for the atrioventricular, dub for the pulmonary or the semilunar, so that pulmonary or aortic valve. So we're hearing the lub dub, lub dub. Valves are closing when we hear those heart sounds. We will take time to listen to heart sounds in lab. Listening to these actual heart sounds is known as auscultation. Auscultation, we use a stethoscope. We put it on different areas in the chest and you can hear different valves closing at different times. That is where this image comes in. This is showing us, if we listen at the second intercostal space, so intercostal, between costal ribs, so between that second and third rib on the right of the sternum, you can hear that aortic valve. On the second intercostal space to the left of the sternum, you can hear that pulmonary valve. Should be one. Yeah, that fifth, and it's right about that sixth rib on the left of the sternum. You can hear that right atrioventricular valve. And it's right about, this one is about mid clavicle. And it's down that fifth intercostal space, right at the middle of the clavicle, down that fifth intercostal space, you can hear that left atrioventricular valve. These are things that we'll go through in lab. We'll go through where to kind of check. You can hear some of these. And we do this through auscultation. So as I said, it's because of those valves closing, that lub. There are those AV valves. Dub or dup, lup, dup, are those semilunar valves. So we'll listen to these in lab. You can listen to your own heart. You can listen to somebody else's heart, and you can kind of play around and listen to what this actually sounds like. A heart murmur. A heart murmur is some sort of abnormal sound in the heart. It can be a clicking instead of that lup dub. It could be some sort of rushing, gurgling. It can be after, before, or even in the middle of the heart sounds. That's where it may mask normal heart sounds. It could be happening in the middle. It's common in children when their heart is still it's pretty well developed when they are born, but it's still more common in children just because everything is still working and trying to grow. You can hear it within like 2 to 4-year-olds usually. And it usually goes away in children with growth. But in an adult, I mean, it can be innocent, but it's usually some kind of valve disorder is what gives us some sort of heart murmur in an adult. Volume changes in the heart. The heart is constantly changing volume. Volume is the amount of blood that is in the heart. Because when blood is filling into the atrium, the atrium contract, it pushes blood into the ventricles. When those ventricles contract, it's pushing blood out of the heart. So it's constantly changing as blood is getting pumped in and out of that heart. The blood that gets pumped out of the heart, the amount is that stroke volume. That is the amount of blood that is getting pumped out of the heart, whether it's going to the lungs, whether it's going to the rest of the body. Either way, it is a volume change. So, mechanical events. What is happening in the heart here? Atrial contraction is when blood is getting pumped from the atrium, right and left, into those ventricles. It happens at the same time, right and left side. It should. Isovolemic contraction, those valves are closing. Then we get ventricular ejection. Those valves are closed. That blood is getting pumped out of the heart. Isovolemic relaxation is when atrium are filling, those ventricles are relaxing. Ventricular filling, that blood is being pumped from those atrium down to those ventricles. So those atrium are contracting as the blood gets pushed down. Everything that is happening in the heart is happening along this P wave, QRX complex, and that T wave. And they continue all day, every day. So that cardiac output, that is how much blood is being pumped out of the heart each minute. So cardiac output, that volume that each minute. That stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped out of the ventricle in one beat. So one contraction of that ventricle, how much blood is being pumped out? That's that stroke volume. We can measure cardiac output. I am not going to ask you to calculate this on the test, but it's still good to know that this cardiac output here how much blood is being pumped out, that stroke volume. Then heartbeat, how many times is that heartbeat per minute? That'll tell us that cardiac output. There is a little bit of cardiac reserve. And this just tells us that not everybody is the same. Because there is a difference between a person's maximum cardiac output and cardiac output at rest. Everybody's is going to be different. Yours is going to be different from mine. But how much blood is pumped out when you're laying in bed versus when you're out running? That's that cardiac reserve. That's the difference between the two. So there's different things that regulate our stroke volume. Preload. That heart muscle is going to stretch as that blood fills into those chambers. That contractility. So how much force does it take to pump that blood out of the heart? And then we have our afterload. That afterload is how much pressure has to be exceeded before the ejection of blood from the ventricles can occur. So how much pressure can those ventricles take before they can have to contract to get rid of that blood out of the heart? So the greater the preload on the cardiac muscle fibers prior to contraction, it increases their force of contraction. This is known as the Frank-Starling law of the heart. So the more blood that fills into the heart, the greater the force of contraction. So the more blood that fills into that atrium, that goes into those ventricles, stretches those ventricles out, the harder that heart has to pump to get that blood out. This works to keep the same volume of blood flowing to both the systemic and the pulmonary circulations at the same time. We need enough blood going to those lungs and coming back from those lungs so that we get enough blood that goes out to the body that is full of oxygen. That contractility. So how strong is that contraction going to be? We have positive inotropic agents, and they're going to increase contractility. We also have negative inotropic agents. These are different types of medications. They decrease the contractility. So they decrease how much force is required, how strong that contraction is, or they increase the strength of that contraction. So for that preload to be constant, the stroke volume increases when the positive inotropic substance is present. So could be the sympathetic nervous system, so epinephrine, norepinephrine. There's also a drug that's called digitalis. This is going to increase contractility, while inhibition, that autonomic nervous system, can also inhibit. Anoxia, acidosis, anesthetics, too much potassium can decrease your contractility of your heart. Afterload. Afterload is the ejection of blood from the heart that begins when the pressure in the right ventricle exceeds the pressure in the pulmonary trunk, and when the pressure in the left ventricle exceeds the pressure in the aorta. So the pressure in those ventricles has to reach a certain point before those semilunar valves open and those ventricles contract. So that pressure has to be strong enough to open those ventricles. If the pressure is not strong enough, from those ventricles contracting, it is not going to open those valves. Things that'll increase afterload is hypertension. So your blood pressure is high. Those arteries get narrowed. We have atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is that fatty plaque kind of buildup in the walls of different vessels. So what regulates our heart rate? Well, that SA node. But there's other things. That medulla oblongata, in the brain. The medulla has the cardiovascular center. It's going to send information along that vagus cranial nerve. Epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those hormones. Cations. Even your age and your gender are going to play a role in your heart rate. Females, we tend to have a higher resting heart rate than males do. It's just a gender thing. Physical fitness is going to play a role. Endurance type of athletes, people who do endurance training, tend to have a slower than normal heart rate. This is known as bradycardia. Brady is below, cardia is heart for that heartbeat. These people tend to have a resting heart rate under 50 beats a minute. I do a lot of endurance training and my heart rate tends to sometimes will get pretty close to this if I'm laying around doing nothing. It usually goes down into the 40s if I'm laying around doing nothing. Temperature. You have a fever, it's going to increase the blood pumping through your body. Strenuous exercise. These are going to cause that SA node to send out signals faster. Hypothermia, your body temperature is below normal. When your body temperature is cooled to a lower core temperature than that 98.6, which is the average body temperature, it starts to slow down your metabolism. Your metabolism gets slower, the oxygen needs to the tissues goes down. So your heart and your brain can go shorter periods or with reduced blood flow. This is how anesthetics work too. Get put to sleep for different surgeries. They're slowing your heart rate down by when in the process of doing that. So there's a lot of different things that are going to play a role in heart rate. There's other places in the brain besides that medulla, that vagus nerve, limbic system, that plays a role in your emotions. Hypothalamus regulates your body temperature. There's a lot of things that are going to measure. So there's a lot of things that are going to increase your cardiac output. Increase preload, increase contractility, decreased afterload, increased stroke volume. Your heart rate goes up. There's different chemicals, different hormones. Age, infants versus senior citizens. Your nervous system. There's a lot of things that play a role in increasing that cardiac output. So aerobic exercise. Aerobic exercise, or regular aerobic exercise, I should say, is going to increase your cardiac output. It increases your HDLs. Those are the good cholesterol. We'll talk about those when we talk about metabolism and nutrition. It decreases triglycerides. Those are those bad fats. They're the ones that tend to get stored in your system. It improves your lung function. It decreases your blood pressure, and it helps you maintain weights, certain weight. During strenuous activity, well-trained, like endurance type of athletes specifically, they can almost double their cardiac output. There's a lot of different heart rate training types of activities that some runners train with for this specific reason, because it helps them run faster and better. But there's cardiomegaly is an increase in heart size. There's two different types. There's physiological and there's pathological. Endurance athletes will tend to have a physiologically increased heart size just because of training. They're constantly training, and it tends to increase. It causes the heart to hypertrophy, causes the heart to enlarge, to get bigger. There's pathological too, and that has to do with some forms of heart disease. Again, well-trained athletes tend to have a very low heart rate when they're resting. So, and it's actually healthier to have a lower heart rate. It scares some people, but it does. So when the heart fails, they have a decreased ability to be able to exercise, or even people get to the point where they can't even move around. Getting up to go get a drink, to go to the bathroom, they can't even do that because they're not getting enough oxygenated blood out to their body. One thing that they can do is a cardiac transplant or a heart transplant. People whose heart is severely damaged, they can transplant it with a heart from a brain dead or a recently deceased donor. People who are organ donors can donate their organs after they pass or if they ever become brain dead. They'll do this with people on end-age heart failure. There's nothing left that they can do to treat them, or coronary artery disease, serious coronary artery disease. So cardiac transplants are an option for people because they'll come in and cut all the arteries and veins that go to the heart, take out the old heart, put in a new heart, and they stitch everything back together so that blood can pump into this new heart now. There's a lot of different things that they can do. They have an intra-aortic balloon pump. They can try to do is they blow back up that blood vessel, try to compress any of that atherosclerosis that may be happening in that blood vessel to allow adequate blood flow to get through. They have ventricular assist devices to help that heart maintain its strong pumping. They have cardiomyoplasty is where they take skeletal muscle and they attach it around the heart to try to get it to help the heart contract. They have skeletal muscle assist devices as well. There's a lot of things they can do with the heart. The different vessels. They can actually put what are called stents into some of these blood vessels to help hold them open. They're permanently inserted into the heart vessels, usually the coronary vessels. They get permanently put in there to help hold vessels open so the heart gets the nutrients that it needs. So your heart, it starts developing from the mesoderm. Those three embryological germ layers, that mesoderm is one of them, and it starts between day 18, day 19, and it comes from cardiogenic mesenchyme within that mesoderm. Day 22, we have a heart tube already. 23, that heart tube gets longer. By 28, we start to get those heart walls as things start to fold in on each other. It's crazy how fast this develops. At this time, we get what is known as the foraminal valley. The foraminal valley, here goes through all the different phases as the heart bends and flips and turns, and eventually by 28, we start to have something that resembles a heart. Here it continues. 28 by 8 weeks. This foraminal valley here, I want to go into this. This foraminal valley is a hole between the right and the left atrium. Because when the fetus or the embryo that turns into a fetus that develops, that heart is pumping blood throughout the body, but it doesn't matter. The lungs aren't functioning. So they're not getting oxygenated and deoxygenated blood pumping through the heart. It's just pumping blood around. That fetus and embryo exchanges and gets nutrients from the umbilical cord. So that's where they're getting that oxygenated blood from. So this foraminal valley just lets blood pass between the two atrium while this fetus is now developing. This foraminal valley will close shortly after birth. It's still usually an impression in the heart. You can see it pretty well in the right atrium. You can see it on the models in the lab. I'll show it to you guys. But this foraminal valley is a hole that allows blood to just pump and flow back and forth through the heart as it's going through the atrium, the ventricles, and around the body. Coronary artery disease. That tells us where it is. It's coronary, so it's the blood vessels that feed the heart. Artery, well, it's carrying oxygenated blood. So we get that atherosclerotic plaques that build up in those coronary arteries. Those plaques that build up, it narrows those arteries. So not enough blood is getting to the tissues in the heart. Most people don't notice it because it's not significant enough until it is almost completely blocked. So they don't notice it until it's almost too late. Smoking is a large cause. Smoking causes everything in the body. High blood pressure. And in the next chapter, when we look at blood vessels, we'll see how blood vessels maintain blood pressure. And the smaller the blood vessels, the harder the heart has to pump, the higher the blood pressure. So as the blood vessels get smaller and smaller, that blood pressure gets higher and higher. Diabetes, high cholesterol, obesity, people who have a type A personality. So people who are constantly go, 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 don't ever stop to relax. They don't know how to relax. They always have to be doing something. But on the other end of the spectrum, people who have a sedentary lifestyle, people who don't exercise, who don't take care of themselves. And then, of course, genetics. Genetics, the one thing on here that you cannot control. So those atherosclerotic plaques, it's where those arterial walls get thickened with like fatty type of deposits that build up. And since those arteries are getting these fatty buildup, they lose their elasticity. They cannot expand or contract down as well as they could before. Low density lipoproteins, or LDLs, as they tend to be known as. It's a type of cholesterol that we find in the blood that'll transport different fatty acids, and it transports cholesterol from the liver to cell membranes. We use cholesterols to make steroid hormones and bile salts. We'll learn more about those in the digestive system. But if we have too many LDLs, it can cause that atherosclerosis. LDLs are known as the bad cholesterol. We mentioned that HDL when we were talking about exercising. HDLs are the good cholesterol. So we do have good and bad. So here's a normal artery. Here's one that has these fatty plaque buildup. It is narrowing the walls by quite a lot. There's a lot of space covered up in here. So this artery isn't as efficient at sending blood to the rest of the body or wherever it needs to go. As I said, there's a lot of congenital heart defects. Congenital is usually something that you are born with. Some of these they monitor. In fetuses, they can sometimes fix it before birth, go in and do surgery on the fetus to try to prevent some of this stuff. So coarctation of the aorta. That aorta is too narrow. That aorta is the largest blood vessel in the body. So if it becomes too narrow, we're not getting enough blood out of the heart, getting enough blood to the rest of the body. Patent ductus arteriosus. So there's a blood vessel between the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. It's supposed to close. Patent ductus arteriosus, it does not close because again, it doesn't matter separating oxygenated blood from deoxygenated blood in a fetus because they're getting their nutrients from the mother, getting the oxygen that they need. So it's another place where blood just kind of passes from that aorta and that pulmonary trunk. And if that does not close, then we're getting mixing oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. A septal defect. So there's an opening in that septum between the right and the left sides. We have an atrial septal defect and a ventricle septal defect. That's that foraminal valley that fails to close that I mentioned before. That ventricular is because that interventricular septum, this whole portion through here, doesn't develop completely. There's tetralogy of Fallot. It has all of these defects. So interventricular septal defect, an aorta that emerges from both ventricles instead of from the left ventricle, a stenosed pulmonary valve, and an enlarged right ventricle. So here is that coarctation of the aorta. Get this narrowing in there. At patent ductus arteriosus, we have a blood vessel going through here. These are connecting. So we're mixing blood. That is that foraminal valley fails to close. Here this ventricle does not completely, or that interventricular septum does not completely finish growing versus that tetralogy. So there's 4 things happening here. There's a lot going on. So arrhythmias. An arrhythmia is an abnormal heart rhythm. It could be because of a defect in your heart's conduction system. Again, bradycardia is a slower than normal heart rate, so under 50 beats per minute. Tachycardia, brady is below, tachy is above. So people who have a resting heart rate of over 100 beats a minute is known as tachycardia. Fibrillation. Your heartbeats are not coordinated. So the right semilunar valve closes and the left semilunar valve closes. You're the right atrioventricular valve, the left atrioventricular valve closes. So they're not closing together. They should be closing at the same time, but they're not. The supraventricular atrial arrhythmias start in the atria versus the ventricular arrhythmia starts in the ventricles. We have supraventricular tachycardia. It's a rapid but regular heartbeat that originates in the atria. So their heartbeat is 160 to 200 beats per minute. There's some maneuvers there's like vagus nerve stimulators that can help to slow this down. Heart block. So from that SA node to that sinoventricular node, there's a block somewhere. So transmission does not get sent out to all areas of the heart to contract. Atrial premature contraction. So it happens too soon. It kind of makes it feel like your heart skips a beat, followed by a more forceful heartbeat the next time. There's atrial fluttering, atrial contractions, very rapid by the atrioventricular block. Atrial fibrillation, mostly in older adults. The contraction of the atrial fibers are asynchronous. The atrium may beat 300 to 600 beats per minute. And the ventricles may try to speed up to try to catch up to what's happening. They don't have a P wave, and their QRS complexes are kind of all over the place. That ventricular premature contraction. So it happens within a region of the heart's conducting system. So contraction occurs early before that SA node is scheduled to discharge its action potential even. Ventricular premature contractions. There can be benign, which means they don't really have a cause behind them. They don't cause damage, but emotional stress. If you take too many stimulants, caffeine, alcohol, nicotine, even a lack of sleep can cause ventricular premature contraction. This is why it's important to sleep. We have ventricular tachycardia. So those ventricles are contracting very quickly. So it originates in those ventricles. You get 4 or more ventricular premature contractions. So those ventricles are beating at least 120 beats per minute. Heart disease, or someone who's recently had a myocardial infarction. Ventricular fibrillation. This is the most deadly. Those ventricles, their contractions are asynchronous. So the right and the left ventricles are not contracting even at the same time. Those ventricles may stop pumping. Blood does not get ejected from the heart to the body or the lungs. Inadequate blood flow to the heart is the most common cause because of coronary artery disease. So if we look at some of these different types of arrhythmias and what we see on an echocardiogram, this is why they use echocardiograms. We can see at the top, it's a normal echocardiogram to kind of compare. That first degree AV block, that we have a long PQ interval versus that atrial fibrillation. There's no P wave. Ventricular tachycardia, that's all over the place. Ventricular fibrillation, there's a lot happening in there. Then congestive heart failure. Congestive heart failure is where that heart, the efficiency of that heart pumping is just not there. Coronary artery disease, there's different congenital defects. High blood pressure, long-term, heart attacks, valve disorders. Your heart it cannot pump effectively anymore. So blood is remaining in the ventricles instead of being pumped out to the body. One side of the heart starts to fail before the other in congestive heart failure. So if that left ventricle fails first, it cannot pump out the blood that it receives. That blood starts to back up, causing blood in the lungs to start to back up. So then fluid starts to accumulate in those lungs, and people that aren't treated, they almost feel like they're suffocating. They get that suffocating feeling because of that fluid. They're almost drowning in their own fluids. If that right ventricle fails first, blood starts to back up in the body, in the veins. The kidneys can increase that blood volume too. Once we get to the urinary system, we'll see how those kidneys help maintain that blood volume. You start to see edema. That's collection of fluids in the tissues. Feet and ankles, because we stand on our feet all day and gravity pulls things down. And that is the end of the heart chapter. Thank you for listening.